I begin the book with two images. The first image is the image of a local militia leader. This was a guy I met traveling to the eastern Congo several years ago doing research for my book in the remote highlands of the eastern Congo. And he was about as stereotypical as a warlord you could find. He had an amulet with monkey skulls. He had and bottle caps. He had a bunch of child soldiers milling about. He had a grass skirt, and he was about, if you think African warlord, this guy was probably as close as you could get. So I said, I would like to interview for my book, and he immediately said, "What's your agenda?" I said, "I don't have an agenda. Just, I'm a journalist. I want to interview for my book." He said, "No, everybody has an agenda. What's your agenda?" And I said, "No, I just want to hear your story. I want to know what the war was like for you. I want to hear your own experiences." And he wasn't going to have any of this. He thought I was, something much more nefarious than a simple journalist. And then, before I left, I said, "Well, could I at least take your picture?" And he said, "No, you can't take my picture. You're going to take my picture and take it off to Ulaya, to Europe, where a bunch of Wazungu are going to look at the picture and think I'm some crazy macaque or African monkey warlord with a bunch of monkey skulls around my neck. That's what they're going to think I am. No, you can't take my picture." Now I tell this story because, to a certain extent, he was right. The second image, I'll explain to you why he was right. The second image I invoke at the beginning of my book is of a gentleman called Otabenga. Otabenga was a pygmy from the central Kasai region in the Congo, who was brought to the United States in 1904 by American missionaries and exhibited in the Bronx Zoo in New York City, in the monkey house, next to orangutans. And there were op-eds, including in the New York Times, that sort of lauded this exhibit and said, "This is an example of evolution and look how far we have come." So perhaps the reason I put these two stories next to each other, while perhaps the images in the press and the media of the Congo today are not as shockingly racist as Otabenga being brought to you. By the way, if you've seen the movie The Something Something Life of Benjamin Button, there's a pygmy in the movie that's supposed to be Otabenga. So the depictions we see in the press these days of the conflict in the Congo are certainly not as shockingly racist as bringing a pygmy and putting him in the monkey house in the Bronx Zoo. But they do often, unfortunately, reduce the conflict to a caricature of itself. It becomes a dance of savage African warlords killing and raping through the country in order to get at the mineral wealth or the money. And I think that these cliches are not very helpful. They don't help us to understand the deep causes of the conflict or devise potential solutions. So the real impulse behind this book was me living in the Eastern Congo for the better part of 10 years and sharing war stories over beers with Congolese politicians and commanders, and just having the deep feeling that there was something about this conflict that was not being portrayed. And as long as we haven't understood that these people are living, breathing humans with interests and incentives of their own, who do things, they may do terrible things, but they do things for good reasons. Until we understand that and understand their stories, we're still going to be trapped in in these caricatures that unfortunately the media resorts to in telling the story. So what does this book do? The book tells the story of the Congo War, and I'll get there. I promise I'll get to the story of the Congo War. From the point of view of the people who lived through it. I don't really appear in the book. I appear in the book as a guy going and interviewing people, but it's not my story. It's a story of the Congolese, the Rwandans, the Ugandans, et cetera, who lived through the war, who were the protagonists in this war. And it has two purposes. One, the basic purpose that I'm not really going to get to tonight, is to explain what happens. It's sort of the ABC of the Congo War. If 5.4 million people have died, and those are the statistics, then how the hell was this possible? The second point of the book is a bit more philosophical. And it's almost more important. And it gets back to these two stories I just told, and that's about motivation and responsibility. It's an ethical question. if, again, 5.4 million people died, how do we apportion blame and responsibility for this? And if we have to go beyond the cliche of savage rebel leaders and try to understand the motives of the involved, what were those motives? So on this question of responsibility, I think the Congo poses an ethical challenge to us that's serious, and we think we need to consider front on. Another story I tell at the beginning of the book is that was one that you probably will be familiar with, which is of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 in Jerusalem. Now, Adolf Eichmann, as many of you will know, was the Nazi official responsible for the transportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to the concentration camps. He was then found by Israeli secret services in Argentina, kidnapped and deported or exported or whatever you want to Israel, where he stood trial. And Hannah Arendt, the famous German philosopher, went to this trial with the goal of trying to understand if so many of my countrymen and so many of my fellow Jews had to die in the Second World War, then why was it? How was it humanly possible for this person to do this? And her conclusion, famously, was that it was this massive state bureaucracy that allowed for Adolf Eichmann really just trying to do his job. He didn't have anything against the Jews. He was actually, he calls himself a Zionist, believe it or not, at one point in the trial, and that he was just trying to get ahead in life. And it was this massive state bureaucracy that dehumanized the victims and allowed for, as she puts it, the industrial production of corpses. And that is what she called the banality of evil. He was a guy just doing his job, and he ended up being complicit and being responsible for massive human suffering. So the reason I'm telling this story is, imagine Hannah Arendt going to the Congo. And instead of going to Jerusalem in 1961, she goes to the Congo to try to understand what is evil in the Congo War. If 5.4 million people died, how do we apportion blame and responsibility? And in many ways, so on some levels, the Congo is very similar. The level of death and suffering, you could say 5.4 million. It's actually probably more than that. Statistics are coming out this coming week that indicate that 400,000 women a year are being raped in the Congo. I mean, it boggles the mind. It's suffering on a scale that it's almost impossible to conceptualize. So on one level, it's similar to the Rwandan genocide, the Cambodian genocide, even the Jewish Holocaust. But there's something very different about the Congo. In the Congo, it was not the massive state bureaucracy that was very systematically, in an organized fashion, intent on exterminating a race. And it was not the mass production of corpses in gas chambers in a very explicit, intentful way. It was not the mass eradication or attack against Tutsi in Rwanda, for example, by genocidal militias in 1994. Instead, here you have a conflict where, even though more than 5 million people have died, only about 500,000, only I say with a great deal of air quotes, only about 500,000 were killed in direct combat, were killed by a machete or a gun. All of the rest of them were killed as a consequence of the war, very unsensationally, perishing due to hunger and disease someplace in the forest away from a TV camera and from the rest of the world. It was not a conflict where you had easily identifiable two sides, where you had heroes and villains, good guys, bad guys, or even authors and victims, perpetrators and victims. It was a conflict, as the introduction pointed out, where you had 9 different African countries. I've counted over 42 different armed groups who were all acting for reasons they felt made sense, but reasons that are very complex.